the cold glass of the Gothic window pressed against my spine, biting through the thin fabric of my blouse. But it was nothing compared to the unnatural, freezing temperature of the hand currently wrapped around my throat. Professor Evelyn Thorne didn't blink. She didn't even seem to breathe. She just loomed over me, trapping me between her heavy mahogany desk and the storm raging outside, her eyes shifting from their usual icy, intellectual blue to a predatory, bleeding crimson. I should have been screaming. Any rational person in this position would be screaming, fighting, clawing at the long, elegant fingers that were slowly bruising their skin. But I wasn't rational. Not anymore. Not since I found the ledger hidden behind the false panel in her library. I stared up at her, paralyzed not just by fear, but by a dark, twisting fascination, watching the way her pupils dilated, swallowing the iris until her eyes were black pools of hunger. I could feel the tremors running through her rigid body, vibrations of restraint that traveled from her arm into my own neck, buzzing against my pulse. She was fighting it. She was fighting the urge to tear my throat out right here in her office, with the grading papers for History 101 still scattered on the floor, where I dropped them in my panic. Her voice, when she finally spoke, wasn't the smooth, lecture hall baritone I was used to hearing discuss the fall of Rome or the Industrial Revolution. It was a growl, a low, tectonic rumble that I felt in my chest more than I heard with my ears. She leaned closer, inhaling the scent of my fear, her nose grazing the sensitive skin below my ear. She told me I had a death wish. She told me that curiosity didn't just kill the cat, it slaughtered it, drained it, and left it for dead in the gutters of London. But I couldn't look away. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, a frantic, syncopated rhythm that I knew she could hear as clearly as a drum in this suffocating silence. I tried to lie. I tried to stammer out an apology, claiming I was just filing papers, just doing my job as her assistant. But the lie tasted like ash and copper in my mouth. I hadn't been just filing papers. I had been snooping. I had been hunting. I had been looking for answers to why a history professor at Oxford hadn't aged a single day in the 40 years since her portrait was painted in the faculty hall. She tightened her grip, just a fraction, enough to cut off my air, enough to make my vision swim with black spots. She asked me what I found. She demanded to know how much I had seen. But instead of answering, instead of begging for my life, my mind drifted back to where this madness began. It drifted back 3 months ago, to the first day of the semester, before the rain, before the darkness, before I knew that monsters walked the halls of academia, wearing tweed jackets and silk scarves. I remember the first time she walked into the lecture hall. It was raining then, too. It always seems to be raining around Evelyn Thorne. The air in the room changed the moment she crossed the threshold. It grew heavier, charged with static electricity, silencing 300 whispering undergraduates in a single heartbeat. She didn't walk. She glided, a figure of sharp lines and monochrome clothing, terrifyingly beautiful and utterly unapproachable. She threw her leather satchel onto the desk with a thud that echoed like a gunshot, turned to the chalkboard, and wrote a single word in perfect archaic cursive: immortality. I was sitting in the front row, desperate to impress, clutching my pen like a lifeline. When she turned around, her gaze swept over the crowd, indifferent, bored until it landed on me. For a second, just 1 second, she paused. It felt like she had reached into my chest and squeezed my heart, I thought she was looking at me because I was the scholarship student, the charity case from the wrong side of the tracks, trying to fit in with the elites. I didn't know then that she wasn't looking at my cheap clothes or my messy notes. She was listening to the blood rushing through my veins. She was smelling the unique chemistry of my O-negative blood type. I was already prey. I just didn't know it yet. That obsession started that day. It wasn't a crush. It was a haunting. I became her research assistant not because I needed the credits, though I did, but because I needed to be close to the cold fire that radiated off of her. I needed to understand why her office always smelled like iron and old roses, why she never ate or drank during our long study sessions, why she only scheduled meetings after sunset. And now, pinned against her window with the lightning illuminating the monster beneath her skin, I finally had my answer. And God help me, I wasn't terrified enough. I looked into those red eyes and realized that the only thing scarier than dying at her hands was the possibility that she might let me go. I didn't just stumble into her office by accident. I walked into the trap willingly, eyes wide open, blinded by an ambition that felt suspiciously like infatuation. 3 weeks after that first lecture, I applied for the position of her private archivist. The job description was strange, demanding absolute discretion, and hours that strictly ranged from dusk until dawn. But I didn't care. When she summoned me to her private residence for the interview, a sprawling, ivy-choked Victorian manor on the outskirts of the city, I should have felt fear. Instead, I felt a magnetic pull, a gravity that dragged me across her threshold and into a world of shadows and silence. Working for Evelyn Thorne was like living in a library at the bottom of the ocean. The silence in her house was absolute, heavy, and pressurized. For months, it was just the two of us in her vast, candlelit study. We were surrounded by towering shelves of books bound in leather that smelled of centuries past, books that shouldn't exist, written in languages that had died out before the printing press was invented. We fell into a rhythm, a dangerous, intimate dance of scholar and apprentice. I would sit on the floor, surrounded by piles of ancient manuscripts, translating Latin and Aramaic, while she paced the room like a caged panther, dictating her thesis in that voice that felt like velvet wrapped around a blade. She never ate. I never saw her drink anything other than a dark, viscous red wine that she kept in a crystal decanter on the highest shelf. And she never, ever let me open the heavy velvet curtains that shielded the room from the outside world. But the most terrifying part wasn't her eccentricities. It was the way she looked at me when she thought I wasn't paying attention. I would feel her gaze on the back of my neck, a physical weight, cold and hungry. When I would turn to catch her, she wouldn't look away. She would hold my gaze, dissecting me, studying me not like a student, but like a specimen, or perhaps like a meal she was saving for a special occasion. There was one night, about a month ago, that changed everything. The storm outside was battering the house, shaking the window panes in their frames, mirroring the turbulence inside my own chest. I was exhausted, my eyes blurring from hours of reading faded ink. I reached for a fresh sheet of parchment, moving too quickly, too carelessly. The edge of the paper was sharp as a razor, and it sliced clean through the skin of my index finger. It was a small cut, insignificant really, but in the silence of that room, the sudden intake of my breath sounded like a scream. I watched as a single, perfect bead of bright crimson blood welled up on my fingertip. I expected Evelyn to offer me a bandage, or perhaps to tell me to be more careful in that dismissive tone she used when I made a translation error. I didn't expect the sound she made. It was a noise that human throats aren't supposed to make. A low, chattering hiss that came from the back of her throat, involuntary and terrifying. I looked up, and she had frozen mid-step. Her back was rigid, every muscle in her body pulled taut like a bowstring about to snap. She turned toward me slowly, unnaturally smooth, and for the first time, I saw the mask slip. Her face, usually so composed and pale, was contorted with a hunger so raw it made my knees weak. Her eyes were fixed on that single drop of blood on my finger, dilating until the blue was completely gone, swallowed by blackness. She crossed the room in a blur of motion, covering the distance between us faster than my mind could process. One moment, she was by the fireplace. The next, she was looming over me, her hand gripping my wrist with a strength that felt like iron bands. Her skin was ice cold against my feverish pulse. She brought my hand up to her face, her nostrils flaring as she inhaled the scent of the copper tang in the air. I should have pulled away. I should have run. But I was paralyzed, trapped in the gravity of her presence. She stared at the wound, her lips parting slightly, revealing the tips of teeth that were just a fraction too sharp, too long to be human. I could feel her breath on my skin, cool and smelling faintly of cloves. She was fighting a war inside herself. I could see it in the twitch of her jaw, in the way her hand trembled against mine. She wanted to taste it. I knew, with a sudden horrifying clarity, that she wanted to drain me dry. But then, the moment broke. She squeezed her eyes shut, a shudder racking her frame, and she shoved my hand away as if I had burned her. She turned her back to me, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and something that sounded heartbreakingly like desperation, ordering me to bandage it, to cover the scent, to never, ever be so careless again. That was the night I should have quit. That was the night I should have packed my bags and never looked back. But instead, that was the night I knew I had to find out what she was. And that curiosity led me to the ledger, and the ledger led me here, pinned against her desk, with her hand on my throat, and death in her eyes. The memory dissolved, leaving me back in the suffocating reality of her office. The storm outside now a dull roar compared to the pounding of my own blood. Her hand was still on my throat, her grip unyielding, her eyes burning with that crimson fire. She had asked me what I found. She was waiting for a confession, for an apology, for me to beg for mercy. But as I looked at her, at the monster struggling beneath the surface of the brilliant professor, fear gave way to a reckless, feverish bravery. I didn't want to beg. I wanted to understand. I reached into my pocket, my movements slow and deliberate, ignoring the way her eyes tracked my hand with predatory intensity. I pulled out the photograph I had taken from the ledger. It was old, a tintype from the late 19th century, edges crumbling with age. It showed a group of students in front of the very building we were standing in, and there, in the center, standing tall and proud in a high-collared Victorian dress, was Evelyn. The same sharp jawline, the same piercing eyes, the same ring on her finger that she wore right now. I held it up, my hand shaking only slightly. The silence that followed was deafening. She looked at the photo, then back at me, and the red in her eyes flickered, dimming for a fraction of a second as something painfully human flashed across her face. Grief. Ancient, crushing grief. She released my throat, stepping back as if the photograph itself had struck her. The sudden rush of oxygen into my lungs made me dizzy, but I didn't fall. I watched as she walked to the window, turning her back to me, staring out into the rain-lashed night. Her posture was different now. The predator was gone, replaced by a figure burdened by the weight of centuries. She asked me, in a voice that sounded like shattering glass, if I knew what I was holding. She asked if I understood that by knowing her secret, I had signed my own death warrant, not because she would kill me, but because her world didn't allow for loose ends. I walked towards her. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run for the door, to escape while her back was turned. But I stepped closer until I was standing just behind her, close enough to feel the cold radiating off her skin. I told her I didn't care about the danger. I told her that I had seen the way she looked at the blood on my finger, how she had stopped herself. A monster wouldn't have stopped. A monster wouldn't be standing here, warning me, giving me a chance to leave. A monster would have feasted. She spun around, her movement so fast it blurred the air. She pinned me against the wall again, but this time her hands weren't on my throat. They were on either side of my head, trapping me in the cage of her arms. Her face was inches from mine, her eyes wild and desperate. She hissed at me that I was a fool, a child playing with fire, who had no concept of the burn. She told me about the hunger, described it as a constant, clawing emptiness, a void that demanded to be filled. She told me that every moment she spent near me was torture, that the sound of my heartbeat was a siren song driving her to madness. She leaned in, her forehead resting against mine, her skin icy against my fever. She whispered that she could hear the pulse in my carotid artery, that she could smell the iron and salt in my blood, and that it was the most intoxicating thing she had encountered in 100 years. It was a threat, but it sounded like a confession of love. Or maybe it was both. In her world, perhaps love and hunger were the same thing. I looked up into her eyes, no longer red, but a deep, turbulent violet, and I made the choice that would damn us both. I didn't pull away. I tilted my head back, baring my throat to her, an offering of absolute trust or absolute stupidity. I told her that I wasn't afraid of her hunger. I was afraid of a world where she didn't exist. And then I waited for the bite. She stared at the exposed skin of my neck, her breath hitching in a sound that was half sob, half growl. The air in the room was thick enough to choke on, charged with the ozone scent of the storm and the metallic tang of imminent violence. I felt the tips of her fangs graze my skin, a sharpness that promised oblivion. My eyes fluttered closed, my body bracing for the pain, for the end. But it didn't come. Instead, I felt something wet and hot against my skin, a tear, then another. The great, immortal Evelyn Thorne was weeping. She pulled back, her hands trembling as they moved from the wall to my shoulders, gripping me not to hurt, but to steady herself. She looked at me with an expression of such profound devastation that it broke my heart. She told me that offering myself wasn't bravery, it was suicide. She told me that if she tasted me, even once, she would never be able to stop. She would drain me until I was a husk, another tragedy to add to her century-long list of regrets. And she refused to let me be a regret. Suddenly, the heavy oak door of the office shuddered under a massive impact. Once, twice, and then the woods splintered inward with a deafening crash. 3 men stormed into the room, rain-soaked and smelling of damp wool and garlic. They weren't police. They were something older, something worse. Hunters. They held stakes carved from white ash and crossbows loaded with silver-tipped bolts. They had found us. They had found her. Evelyn didn't hesitate. In a split second, the weeping woman vanished, replaced by the apex predator I had glimpsed earlier. She shoved me behind her, her body becoming a shield between me and the intruders. She didn't speak. She just let out a low, warning hiss that made the hairs on my arms stand up. The leader of the hunters raised his crossbow, aiming straight for her heart. He sneered, calling her a leech, an abomination, claiming her time was up. He fired. I screamed, but Evelyn moved faster than the bolt. She caught it out of the air, her hand a blur, snapping the wood in half like a twig. Then she moved. It wasn't a fight. It was a massacre of efficiency. She was a whirlwind of black silk and lethal force. She disarmed the first man before he could draw a breath, sending him flying across the room into a bookshelf that collapsed under his weight. The second man swung a stake, but she ducked under his arm, grabbing him by the collar and throwing him through the open door into the hallway. The third hunter, the leader, panicked. He dropped his crossbow and pulled a gun, aiming not at her, but at me. The shot rang out, deafening in the enclosed space. I flinched, waiting for the impact, but I felt nothing. I opened my eyes to see Evelyn standing directly in front of me, her back to the gunman. She jolted, a small, sharp gasp escaping her lips, but she didn't fall. She turned slowly, her eyes glowing a furious, blinding red. The hunter looked at his gun, then at her, his face draining of color. He realized his mistake too late. You don't threaten what a dragon guards. She crossed the room in a single stride, grabbing him by the throat and lifting him off the floor with one hand. She leaned in close, whispering something in his ear, a promise, a threat, a final judgment, before she tossed him aside, unconscious before he hit the ground. Silence fell over the room again, heavier than before. Evelyn stood amidst the wreckage of her life, her chest heaving, her blood seeping through the back of her white shirt. She turned to me, her eyes fading back to blue, filled with fear. Not for herself, but for me. She asked if I was hurt. She asked if I was okay. She didn't seem to realize she had a silver bullet lodged in her shoulder. She swayed, her immortality failing her for the first time, and I ran to catch her before she fell. I caught her just as her knees gave way, the weight of her solid and real in my arms. We slid to the floor together, surrounded by shattered glass and ancient books, the storm outside finally breaking into a gentle, weeping rain. I pressed my hands against her shoulder, trying to staunch the flow of dark, sluggish blood. It burned my skin, hot and strange, but I didn't pull away. For a creature who supposedly couldn't die, she looked terrifyingly fragile in the dim light. Her skin was translucent, the veins beneath like blue lace, her breathing shallow and ragged. "You idiot," I whispered, my voice thick with tears, echoing the words she had thrown at me earlier. "You jumped in front of a gun. You're supposed to be the immortal one." She let out a weak, breathy laugh that turned into a wince. She looked up at me, her hand reaching up to touch my cheek, smearing a streak of her own blood against my skin. It felt like a brand, a mark of ownership I would never wash off. She told me that immortality was worthless if she had to spend it alone. She told me that for 100 years she had been surviving, but in the moment she saw that gun pointed at me, she remembered what it meant to be alive. I helped her up, guiding her not to a hospital. She couldn't go to a hospital, not with her body temperature and no heartbeat, but to the hidden safe room behind the library, the one place the hunters hadn't breached. I spent the next hour playing doctor to a vampire, digging a silver bullet out of her shoulder with tweezers, sterilized in brandy, stitching skin that was already knitting itself back together before my eyes. She watched me the entire time, her gaze intense and unreadable, studying my face as if she was memorizing it for the next century. When it was done, when the bandages were wrapped and the fire was lit, we sat in the silence of the safe room. The dynamic had shifted. I wasn't just her student anymore, and she wasn't just my professor. We were conspirators, partners. She told me we had to leave. Oxford wasn't safe. The hunters would return with reinforcements. She talked about safe houses in Vienna, contacts in Prague, a life on the run. She gave me an out. She told me I could walk away right now, go back to my dorm, forget everything I had seen, and live a normal, safe, sunlit life. I looked at her, really looked at her. I saw the loneliness etched into the lines of her face, the centuries of solitude she wore like a heavy coat. I thought about my life before her, the gray routine, the meaningless ambition. And then I thought about the fire in her eyes when she stood between me and death. I took her hand, interlacing my fingers with hers, feeling the cold seep into my bones, a cold that now felt like home. I don't want safe, I said, my voice steady for the first time that night. I want you. She stared at me, searching for hesitation, for fear. Finding none, she leaned in, her lips brushing against mine, soft and hesitant, a question rather than a demand. When I kissed her back, it tasted of iron and brandy and rain. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. We were fugitives. We were monsters. Or at least, we were in love with them. But as the first light of dawn began to creep through the cracks in the shutters, threatening to burn the world away, I knew one thing for certain. I would walk into the fire with her, again and again, just to stay by her side.